Welcome back, folks, to part 3 of our reproductive unit notes. And part 3 will cover the basic structures of the female reproductive system. So, female reproductive anatomy, just like the male reproductive anatomy, the primary female reproductive organ are the ovaries. They're analogous to the testicles. Their job is to make the female gametes, otherwise known as ova. They also secrete the female sex hormones, which are estrogen and progesterone. There's a number of accessory ducts, just like there were in the male. Those include the uterine tubes, otherwise known as fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. They include internal genitalia, like the ovaries and the internal ducts, and the external genitalia, which will be the external sex organs, which we'll talk about those later. Here we can see just a quick overview of the parts. The front is on the right here with the mons pubis, that kind of mound over the pubic bone. Going back from that, we can see the pubis or the pubic symphysis. Behind that, we see the bladder and the urethra. Behind that, we have the uterus and the vagina. Up above the uterus, we can see where the ovary and the fallopian tubes are. And moving back from there, we can see the rectum, and then here's the gluteus maximus region, and the anus is down there. Taking a look from the back side here into the uterus, we can see, starting from the bottom up, we got the vagina, which ends in the cervix. Then you go into the uterus itself. We've got fallopian tubes and then ovaries. And then we have a number of ligaments that help to hold things in place, which are particularly important once the baby starts growing, because there's a lot of weight that needs to be held up in there. All right. Let's start our journey with the ovaries. The ovaries, you're born with all the immature eggs called oocytes that you're ever going to have, females, and they're surrounded by a layer of cells called the follicle. Okay. Ovulation is the term we use when we're talking about the ejection of the oocyte, the egg, from the follicle and moving into the fallopian tube or uterine tubes. And then there's something called the corpus luteum, which is what happens to those follicle cells after ovulation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So here we can see an ovary. It's got a good blood supply. It's got a ligament that's holding it in place. And we'll start up here on kind of the upper middle, where we have these immature oocytes and primary follicles. About once a month, women will start to mature some oocytes. Generally, only one makes it all the way to maturation. Sometimes you'll get 2 twins or 3 triplets, but generally it's one oocyte will fully mature, and you can see the follicle is growing around that. Now, this kind of lays out and makes it look like the follicle and the egg is moving around in the ovary, like it's some sort of a egg carousel. It's not. This all happens in one place. They're just kind of laying it out that way so you can see it in progression. It gets bigger and bigger. Near the end, we can see on the right, we can see a nice microscope image of the oocyte inside the follicle. Here we have the ruptured follicle. This is ovulation occurring right there. There's the oocyte, which is heading off to hopefully get fertilized. And then next we have the corpus luteum starts to develop from the leftover follicle. And then over a little bit further along, we have a fully developed corpus luteum. And we'll talk about how long that sticks around a little bit later. All right, so now the egg's been ovulated. It's going into the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes and the oviducts. So these will receive the ovulated oocyte, and they provide a site for fertilization. Fertilization happens in the uterine tubes, not in the uterus generally. So we'll take a look at that later in the notes. The uterine tubes do empty into the uterus. They expand around the ovary, forming something called the ampulla. And the ampulla has finger-like projections called fimbriae that can move around, which are pretty important for the ovulation portion of the cycle. So here we can see the ovary. We can see the fimbriae and the ampulla and the uterine tubes leading into the uterus. We'll take a closer look at the parts of the uterus a little bit later. The uterine tubes have no contact with the ovaries. There's not a direct connection with the ovaries. They're just, if this is an ovary and here's the ampulla and the fimbriae, they're close, but not quite touching. So that ovulated oocyte is just cast into the general peritoneal cavity. and then it gets brushed into by the cilia of the fimbriae, trying to bring currents and bring the oocyte into the uterine tube. Every once in a while, one can escape and just go wandering through your belly. Those generally aren't going to get fertilized, but they can escape. The oocyte or egg is carried towards the uterus by peristalsis. So rhythmic contractions of the muscle and ciliary action. There's cilia inside that uterine tube. There are some non-ciliated cells in there which keep the oocyte and the sperm nourished and moist, because just like we talked about with the male, the sperm needs nourishment. It's a cell. If it's going to live for very long, it needs to have nourishment and be protected. And the same is true of the egg. It is a living cell. It needs nourishment. So these non-ciliated cells keep both the oocyte and the sperm nourished and moist until it implants. So that's very important. We'll show a quick animation of this process.
Ovulation is a part of the menstrual cycle when the ovary releases a ripe egg, or ovum. Inside the ovary are hundreds of thousands of follicles. Each follicle is a hollow ball of cells with an immature egg in the center. The typical 28-day menstrual cycle begins on the first day of menstrual bleeding. During the first 7 days of the cycle, a few follicles begin to grow at the same time. These maturing follicles secrete estrogen hormone into the bloodstream to prepare the lining of the uterus for pregnancy. Around day 7, all of the follicles stop growing and begin to degenerate, except for one. This dominant follicle continues to grow and nourishes the developing egg inside it. Around day 12, the follicle secretes a large amount of estrogen into the bloodstream. When the estrogen reaches the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in the brain, the anterior or front part of the pituitary gland releases a huge surge of luteinizing hormone into the bloodstream. Around day 14, luteinizing hormone causes the follicle to undergo a sudden growth spurt. Right before ovulation, the egg detaches from the inside of the follicle. The bulging follicle releases chemicals, causing one of the two fallopian tubes to move in closer and surround the follicle. The follicle swells until it bursts open, ejecting the egg and fluid from the follicle into the abdominal cavity. In response, the fimbriae, tiny projections at the end of the fallopian tube, sweep across the ovulation site and pick up the egg. Microscopic cilia on the fimbriae's surface transport the egg to the entrance of the fallopian tube. Inside the walls of the fallopian tube, muscular contractions gently push the egg towards the uterus. After ovulation, the egg lives for 12 to 24 hours, so it must be fertilized by a sperm from the male during this time for a woman to become pregnant. If it's not fertilized, the egg dissolves away and is shed along with the uterine lining during menstruation.
So now we've gotten that, the uterus. We'll take a look at that. If the egg was fertilized, it's going to come down to the uterus. If not, it will come down to the uterus anyway, just won't be able to get fertilized at that point, and will get expelled with the menstrual cycle. So the uterus is hollow. It's a very thick-walled organ, got a lot of muscle around it, located in the pelvis. It's anterior to the rectum and posto-superior to the bladder, so above and behind the bladder. The main part is called the body. The top is the fundus, and that's where the uterine tubes come in. The isthmus is where it narrows down towards the cervix, just like an isthmus of land in geography is that point of land kind of pointing out in the ocean. Isthmus is kind of that here. And then the cervix is kind of a muscular tube at the very bottom of the vagina, and it's where things have to go in and out of the vagina. All right, so here's a diagram of the uterus. So we already saw the ovary and the uterine tubes coming in. Fundus is up here at the top. Then we got the body of the uterus here. The inner lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. That's the part that grows and sloughs off every month. The myometrium, as the name implies, myo for muscle, that is the thick muscular section, which becomes much thinner when the baby stretches it out. And then down below there, we have the cervix, that kind of tube of muscle, which actually projects a little bit into the vagina, and the isthmus there is where it's coming in, where the cervix and the uterus meet. And then we have the vagina, which is a much thinner walled structure, which goes from the cervix on out. All right, so the endometrium, inner lining, inner, has numerous uterine glands that change in length as the endometrial lining thickens and changes over the course of the 28-day menstrual cycle. That underlying lining layer undergoes cyclic changes, like I said, in response to ovarian hormones, and we will get into those hormone cascades later, and then is shed during menstruation. Deep to that lining layer, below lining layer, we form a new lining after menstruation ends and builds back up and starts all over again. We'll get into that in a lot more detail later. Onto the vagina. It's a relatively thin-walled tube between the bladder and the rectum, extends from the cervix to the exterior, and it is a passageway for birth, menstrual flow, and is the organ of copulation. It is designed to be the right size and shape, not only to let the baby out, but also to let the penis in so that sperm can be delivered. And mucosa near the vaginal orifice, the opening of the vagina, forms an incomplete partition called a hymen, more colloquially known as the cherry. And that is generally in place from early on, but it can be broken not just by sex. It's not the best measure of virginity, even though in many cultures they check for it, which can be quite devastating for females who have it broken through other things, horseback riding, car accidents, just randomly it can break. It's not very tough, so you can't use that as a measure of virginity. And in some cultures where if you're not a virgin, it can be very bad for you. They actually make artificial hymens that can actually even bleed, that they can put in to try to get around that so they're not stigmatized and or ostracized because of it. You can read up on it if you want to. It can be a pretty rough situation. All right, so here we can see the external genitalia. Just a quick look here. We'll talk about the different parts and then show it again, but we've got the mons pubis on top of the labia majora and minora, the clitoris, the prepuce. Here's the urethral orifice where the urethra comes out, and then we have the vagina with the hymen intact in this case. Bulbourothelial glands, or vestibular glands, sorry, get mixed up with male structures. And then at the bottom we have the anus. All right, so that vulva there we're looking at, or otherwise known as the pudendum. External to the vagina includes mons pubis, labia, clitoris, and vestibular structures. The mons pubis is that round fatty area over the pubic symphysis that we talked about. The labia majora literally means large lips, labia. Those are elongated, generally hair covered, fatty skin folds. They're homologous to the male scrotum. And we'll see what we mean by homologous later, but they develop from the same original tissues that the scrotum does. The labia minora, which are inside that, are generally hair-free. Within the labia majora, generally more moist in there, and they're homologous to the ventral side of the penis in the male. Greater vestibular glands, pea-sized little glands flanking the vagina, and they keep the vestibule moist and lubricated. I know you guys hate the word moist, but it's the best word to use. And then the clitoris, which is homologous to the penis, as most people know. And that erectile tissue, it is erectile tissue in the same way the penis is, and it does become erect when stimulated, is hooded by the prepuce, which is similar to the male penis, which has a foreskin. So here we can see those again. I'll let you take a look here. You can pause the video and make sure you can identify each of those parts we just talked about. All right, moving on to mammary glands. They are sexual structures involved with having babies and affected by pregnancy and birth. They are literally modified sweat glands that radiate around and open at the nipple. So modified sweat glands. We think, and this is characters of mammals, all mammals have them. That's why they're named mammals, because they do produce milk to feed their young. We think this likely started with some, evolutionarily speaking, some infants started licking their mother's sweat, which gave them electrolytes and various trace things that the mother was maybe producing. And the babies that did that were able to survive better. They got a little better nutrition than they would have otherwise. And over time, that back and forth of evolution, the sweat glands started producing more nutrients, becoming more concentrated in a certain area, to the point where infants in the mammal species rely pretty much solely on mammary secretions or milk for nourishment for the first chunk of time of their life. Now, the areola is the pigmented skin surrounding the nipple itself, And then you have the compound alveolar glands, which produce milk, and then pass it to the lactiferous ducts, which then open to the outside at the nipple. And so here we can see a good cross-section of that. On the right, we can see the pectoral muscles and the ribs, and then we can see those lactiferous glands, lactiferous ducts. We can see that little bulbs in the nipple. That's what the baby squeezes to get milk to come out. It's not just sucking, or you hope the baby's not just sucking. If the baby's only sucking, it can be quite painful to the female. It's not the most efficient way. When the baby is drinking, it really needs to squeeze those bulbs, which by latching on around the areola, squeezing down on the areola, and that will squirt milk into its mouth, which he can then drink. And we can see those ducts coming out of the nipple there. And we can see it's also got a good amount of fat there for extra fat storage, which is necessary if you're going to have a baby. You don't want to be worried about not having enough energy to feed yourself and the baby. You want to have some fat stored up ahead of time. That's why females have more fat in general, just everywhere under the skin, than males do on a regular basis. Okay. And that does us for looking at the structures of the female. Next time, guys, we'll talk about cycles and hormones. See you then.